the record, spelling your first name and last name.
Shanda Vander Ark, Shanda Vander, space capital ARK.
Look at her face in this footage right here. Just look closely at her eyes for a second. There's literally nothing there. There's no panic, no maternal grief, no sense of the gravity for where she is or what she's even being accused of. When I first read this case file, I actually had to sit for a minute. I had to put my phone down, take a step back, and just pause. Because something seemed off. It didn't quite make sense when I was looking at this. It didn't fit. I have spent nearly 2 decades sitting across from people in deep crisis. People who have had terrible, unspeakable things done to them. But this level of flat emotional void, it's deeply disturbing. It's almost unnatural. I mean, how does a mother's brain completely shut off empathy like that? How do you sit there on a witness stand and describe things so horrific with the exact same tone that you might use with a to-do list or to talk about the weather? It's like she constructed an entirely separate, sterile reality where her actions were somehow completely logical to her. It makes you wonder what's actually happening beneath the surface, behind that blank stare. We're not just talking about a person who made bad choices. We're looking at a mind that has systematically rerouted its own moral compass. Today, we're using a clinical lens to look at Shanda Vander Ark and the concept of extreme compartmentalization. People may see a cold-blooded, calculated individual, and make no mistake, she is. But as a therapist, I'm looking at a different possibility, a deeper, more clinical explanation of the why behind her ability to completely divide her mind. Because healthy minds simply don't do this. A normal brain has checks and balances. It feels guilt and it feels conflict when actions don't align with their values. But here, there has to be a severe structural breakdown in how she processes reality. It's a psychological defense mechanism that became so deeply warped, so incredibly toxic, that it allowed her to separate her identity as a highly educated, structured mother from the reality of the cruelty happening right in her home, right under her roof. We're going to unpack exactly how a person can live a double life in their own mind, acting as a disciplined professional by day while orchestrating a nightmare by night. This was the architect of a pathological control in her home. If we don't understand how these toxic psychological walls are built, we risk missing the subtle, dangerous warning signs in our own communities. These behaviors don't just exist in high-profile courtrooms or true crime documentaries. They start in the quiet neighborhoods, behind closed doors, hidden under a mask of normal, everyday life. Often the most dangerous people aren't the ones screaming from the streets. They are the ones who present themselves as orderly, respectful, and completely in control. You would never know. Understanding this isn't just about dissecting a tragedy. It's about learning how the human mind can hide dark, controlling behavior under the guise of structure and rules. Think of this as a survival skill for the real world. And by studying this, we learn to look past the surface presentation and see the actual dynamics at play in the relationships around us. There's one specific chilling psychological mechanism that she used to pull her older son, Paul, into her system of control. It's a tactic that almost everyone is completely missing when they talk about this case. Maybe you have seen it, maybe not. It wasn't just a simple threats or physical force. It was something far more insidious, a systematic dismantling of his boundaries until he became an extension of her own will. We'll get exactly how she pulled that off and the exact moment his compliance turned active in just a moment. When you see how she slowly eroded his sense of self, it will change the way you think about family loyalty and family dynamics forever. As a licensed professional counselor, when I look at Shanda, I don't see someone who just suddenly snapped one day. And I don't see an explosive, chaotic break from reality either. What I see, what my opinion is a highly organized example of pathological control. Today, we're going to peel back this maternal mask that she wore so carefully and see exactly where it starts to break, where the clinical reality slips through the cracks, and what that tells us about her true psychological state. We're going to look at the exact moments her carefully constructed narrative began to crumble under cross-examination. And we'll analyze the tiny slips in her body language that reveal the deep-seated anger hiding beneath her calm exterior. And by the end of this video, you'll know the exact psychological red flags that even the most calculated individuals just can't hide. And it's skills that you can actually use to spot manipulation and deep deception in your own life. Because the tactics that she used on her family, they're just extreme, highly toxic versions of compliance and control tactics that manipulators use every day. Whether it's in the workplace or friendship or family, the warning signs of pathological control follow a highly predictable pattern once you know what to look for. But before we go any further, I want to quickly note here. I'm John Cordray. I'm an LPC. That's a licensed professional counselor. I've been licensed since 2007. And everything that I say in this video is my clinical speculation based on the records that I've seen and the behaviors that I've observed in the courtroom. It's not a formal diagnosis of anyone involved in this case. All right, so let's dive straight into Shanda's clinical file, starting with the timeline of her household control. So let's look closely at the developmental blueprint of how this absolute control was actually constructed. Shanda wasn't someone who just woke up one day and decided to be cruel. No. It was a gradual, highly calculated progression. Her blueprint looks like this. It begins as a catalyst with the background of powerlessness. Then the tool, the law school and analytical training, and then the shield was developed with her obsessive, rigid household rules. And then came the weapon, subjugation. Her family was no longer viewed as people. She was highly analytical, incredibly intelligent, and she actually held a law degree. Now think about that for a second. Law school teaches you to compartmentalize. It teaches you to look at the human suffering, evidence, and conflict through a cold procedural lens. I'm not saying all lawyers are cold. I'm not saying that. And it trains your brain to separate emotion from facts. That's actually a good thing. And for Shanda, that analytical training became the blueprint for her entire life. Her intellect became her primary psychological weapon. It allowed her to justify things that any normal person would find completely unacceptable. She used her sharp mind to establish an obsessive, rigid household. In her mind, there was a strict protocol for everything, every chore, every minute, every interaction. But clinically, when I see this level of absolute suffocating rigidity, I don't see strength. I don't see discipline. I see a profound, desperate fear of vulnerability. Often when individuals grow up in environments where they feel completely powerless, they develop an extreme coping mechanism. They decide they will never lose control again. Control becomes their psychological shield against the world that they perceive as hostile and chaotic. The tragic problem is when this shield is worn by a parent, it inevitably becomes a weapon. Shanda's need for order mutated. into a pathological system where her family members weren't treated as people anymore. They were simply variables to be managed, to be regulated, and ultimately subjugated to her will. I actually had to pause when looking at the chronological timeline of her household rules. It was cold. It was legalistic. It was a very, very, very strict framework. She was essentially prosecuting her own children daily, setting up trap after trap where failure was inevitable and punishment was the only logical outcome. It was a highly organized, closed psychological loop. When we look at her history, we see a pattern of using rules not really to teach, but to dominate. It was a complete inversion of the parental role. Now, we have to talk about the heartbreaking, devastating center of this entire tragedy, Shanda's youngest son, Timothy. When you look at a highly controlling household, it doesn't just create general scattered chaos. It almost always designates a scapegoat. In clinical terms, we talk about systematic dehumanization and projected shame. Shanda didn't just abuse Timothy. She turned him into the family's emotional and psychological heat sink. Pull up graphic 11. Think of a heat sink in a computer. It's a block of metal designed to absorb all the destructive excess heat from the processor so the system doesn't melt down. In this warped family system, Shanda was the processor, running at a dangerously high pathological temperature of control and unexpressed rage. She needed a place to dump that toxic energy, and she chose Timothy. Heartbreaking. He became the lightning rod for every failure, every insecurity, and every drop of anger she possessed. By focusing all of her negative psychological energy on him, she could keep the rest of her system running in its sick version of order. He was the sacrifice she made to maintain her own fragile illusion of control. But how does a mother look at her child and treat them like an object? Clinically, it starts with dismantling as a person. She stripped away his humanity in her own mind first. She stopped seeing Timothy as a living, breathing teenager with feelings and dreams and a need for safety. Instead, she viewed him as a project, a problem to be solved, and eventually an adversary to be conquered. When you dehumanize someone, you remove their face. And once you remove their face, your natural maternal empathy, the biological wiring that's supposed to protect your child at all costs, is completely bypassed. She didn't look at him as a son anymore, but as a compilation of behaviors that needed to be forcibly corrected. Timothy became the scapegoat in a deeply psychological heat sink. And to make matters worse, she forced this perspective onto the rest of the household. Her oldest son. She taught Paul to see his brother the exact same way. She used clinical cold rules to turn Timothy's basic human needs into infractions. If he was hungry, he was labeled manipulative. If he was tired, he was called rebellious. If he sought comfort, he was deceitful. This is a classic psychological gaslighting technique where the victim's natural survival instincts are reframed as moral failures. Timothy was subjected to what's called learned helplessness. Imagine being placed in a maze where every single turn leads to an electric shock. It doesn't matter if you turn left or turn right, go forward or stand still. The pain is constant and unpredictable. Eventually, your brain stops trying to find an exit. You lie down. You accept the pain because your mind has been so conditioned to believe that you have absolutely zero agency. Timothy was trapped in that exact psychological maze. He was completely isolated. He was starved of food and starved of human kindness. When you look at the evidence, you see a young boy who was systematically broken until his spirit was entirely crushed. He wasn't just physically trapped in that house. He was psychologically locked in a dark room where his mother held the only key and kept telling him he deserved to be there. He had no outside advocates, no school friends to check on him, and a mother who had completely severed her biological bond to him. This is why understanding Shanda's pathology is so critical. Timothy's tragic outcome wasn't a random act of passion. It was a slow, deliberate, and quiet execution of a toxic system. She systematically turned off her empathy, room by room, until there was nothing left but cold, sterile calculations. I know, that's already a lot to take in. It's incredibly heavy. And honestly, reading through these clinical files, it's draining. It makes me stop and think about the sheer weight of what must have been happening behind those closed doors to poor Timothy. Let's just take a breath for a second. Let's pause. I don't want to rush through this. Hey friends, if you're finding this deep dive into behavioral psychology and family systems helpful, although tragic, go ahead and karate chop that subscribe button. All right, so let's look at why this actually matters for you. It's because pathological control doesn't just appear overnight out of the thin air. It's a system. It starts small. It begins with micromanagement, with demands for absolute obedience under the guise of structure or high standards. If we can recognize these rigid patterns early, we can spot the warning signs of coercive, abusive environments before they escalate into an absolute tragedy. We study this not to stare at the dark side of humanity, but to learn how to shine a light on it. But here's where Shanda's psychological manipulation gets even more complicated and, quite frankly, more gut-wrenching. Let's step directly into the courtroom, because this is where Shanda's clinical mask really starts to show its seams. And honestly, as a therapist, it's one of the most chilling things that I've seen in a while. When she takes the stand, she doesn't behave like a panicked defendant or a grieving mother. She's cold and precise and almost robotic. It's like watching a computer running on a highly calculated code. If you watch her eyes, her posture, there's no warmth, no remorse. It's like watching a surgeon describe a routine, sterile operation, but instead of the medical procedure, she's detailing the systematic, tragic abuse of her own son, Timothy. In the therapeutic world, we call this the isolation of affect. It's a defense mechanism where the mind completely detaches the factual reality of an event from its emotional weight. It's a pressure cooker ready to explode. Under cross-examination, tiny cracks start to appear on her jaw and her shifted breathing. Those micro-expressions are not driven by remorse. They spike strictly when her narrative is challenged. For a pathological controller, losing control is the ultimate form of a psychological death. Imagine a massive roaring house fire. Instead of feeling terror, running for help, or finding water, you sit calmly on the porch, analyzing the chemical properties of the rising flames. That's Shanda. Her language is entirely sterile, stripped of any human warmth. She uses clinical detached words like regimen, protocol, and discipline to describe acts of unspeakable cruelty. That's what we call semantic whitewashing, renaming horrific acts to strip them of their human cost. It's a way for her to build a massive psychological wall in her own mind, a fortress separating her identity as an orderly mother from the reality of the monster she became in that house. It allowed her to preserve her internal narrative, convincing herself she was simply a disciplined parent managing a chaotic household. But she didn't act entirely alone. And that brings us to the devastating, highly complex dynamic between Shanda and her older son, Paul. As a clinician, this is the most heartbreaking part of the file to unpack, other than Timothy. How does a mother convince her own child to participate in this level of cruelty against his sibling? Clinically, she achieved this through coercive persuasion, which is essentially a slow motion psychological reprogramming of another human being. It's a slow dripping poison. Think of Paul's mind as a house. Shanda didn't just break into it. She slowly went room by room, dismantling the load-bearing walls of his moral autonomy. She replaces internal compass with her own rigid, warped rules. It's a psychological phenomenon where a person's boundaries are so completely eroded by a dominant figure that they begin to outsource their own conscience to the controller. He became a satellite orbiting her heavy, dark gravity, entirely unable to generate independent moral thoughts. He was trapped in a room of mirrors where the only reflection he was allowed to see was the one that she approved of. It's a terrifying state of mind because you lose the ability to see where your identity ends and your abuser's commands begin. She achieved this through a toxic combination of severe isolation and intermittent reinforcement, which clinically operates like a powerful chemical addiction. By cutting Paul off and then making her shifting approval his only source of safety, she created a system where pleasing her became a matter of basic psychological survival. Imagine being lost in a scorching desert, and the person holding the only bottle of water is also the one who drove you out there. That was Shanda to Paul. She was both the drought and the well. She warped his natural empathy, conditioning him to view his younger brother not really as a sibling to be protected, but as a disruptive, chaotic threat to the household's perfect order. Had to be perfect, or else. Over time, Paul's independent agency was completely erased, and he was systematically molded into a physical extension of Shanda's will, acting as her hands while she remained the cold, calculating brain of the entire operation. When we look back at Shanda on the stand, when she talks about Paul's involvement, there's a subtle shift. You can see her trying to maintain that sterile managerial distance. But under cross-examination, when the prosecutor starts pushing past her clinical terminology, you can see the tiny cracks in her armor. In therapy, we look for those micro-expressions because they're the steam escaping from that tightly sealed pressure cooker. She isn't angry because of what happened to Timothy. She's angry because her perfect system of control is being dismantled right in front of the world. She's losing her grip on the narrative. She's losing control. She tries to shift the blame to Paul, presenting him as the one who went too far, completely blind to the fact that she was the one who built the machine, programmed the code, and turned the key and threw it away. I really want to go deeper into Paul here because this is a double tragedy. Yes, I'm not excusing Paul's behavior. Not at all. But would he have done this on his own if it wasn't for his mom? I don't think so. Most people look at Paul and they see a cold-blooded compliance. And he did comply. But as a clinician, I'm looking at a different possibility here in Paul. The fragile psychology of the compliant partner. And honestly, when I first read about this part of the case file, it took me a second to process it. I mean, how does a young man speak so calmly, so matter-of-factly about the unimaginable things done to his own brother? It's chilling. But if we just label him as a bad seed and move on, we miss the entire warning here. The stake here is incredibly high because the path from a quiet, normal kid to an active participant in trauma is shorter than any of us wants to admit. And there's one massive cognitive bias happening here that almost everyone is missing. And we'll uncover that in a second. When I look at the evidence on Paul, I don't see simple compliance. I see an extreme, almost terrifying example of enmeshment. Let's look at that word for a second. Enmeshment. You probably heard about it before. You know what that means. In a healthy family, there are boundaries. You are you, and your parent is your parents. But in Shanda's house, those boundaries didn't just blur. They were completely obliterated. Paul was psychologically swallowed by his mother. And when a parent has that level of absolute pathological control, the child's sense of self is erased. Shanda alienated Paul and eliminated reality to establish a single source of truth and safety. This leads us to what I was talking about earlier about Timothy. It's a dehumanization. You stop acting as an individual with your own moral compass and you start acting as an extension of the dominant figure. He wasn't operating as Paul anymore. He was operating as Shanda's instrument. It's easy to look at the courtroom footage and think, I would never do that. Of course I wouldn't. But psychological research, like the famous Milgram studies on obedience to authority, this shows us that under the right kind of pressure, a normal person can do terrible things. Now let's address that flat, emotionless tone in his testimony. When Paul talks about the ice baths, the starvation, the endless cruelty, his voice doesn't even waver. To the jury and to most people watching, that looked like a total lack of empathy. But as a therapist, I look at that and I see a dissociation and compartmentalization. Think about it. If Paul let himself actually feel the weight of what was happening to Timothy, his mind would have completely shattered a long time ago. He couldn't survive his own mother's wrath, and he couldn't bear the guilt of what he was doing. There's no way he could have done that without compartmentalizing. So his brain did what minds do when trapped in trauma. It flipped a switch. He numbed himself. He compartmentalized the horror into a separate mental box so he can function day to day. And that flat affect isn't a sign that he didn't care. It's the psychological scar tissue of his mind that had to freeze its own humanity just to survive. And this brings us to the massive cognitive bias I mentioned earlier. It's something called diffusion of responsibility. When we're ordered to do something by an authority figure, especially a highly abusive, terrifying parent, our brains play a dangerous trick on us. We tell ourselves, I'm not the one doing this. I'm just the hands. She's the brain. Because the decision-making power was entirely Shanda's, Paul was able to offload his own guilt. In his mind, he wasn't the perpetrator. He was just a bystander following orders. It's a devastating coping mechanism that allows a person to participate in unspeakable acts while keeping their own conscious mind from breaking under that guilt. But here's where it gets even more complex. In this kind of toxic family dynamic, a survival hierarchy is established. You have the abuser at the top, the scapegoat at the bottom, and the compliant partner in the middle. Paul knew on a deep primal level that if he didn't help Shanda target Timothy, he would become the target himself next. This is a classic symptom of traumatic bonding. He bonded with his abuser, aligning with her worldview and her actions, because standing next to a predator was the only safe place in that house. This is the extreme tragedy of systemic coercion. It doesn't just destroy the physical victim. It completely erodes the moral agency of those caught in its orbit. I know that's a heavy clinical truth to swallow, but it's really the only way we can begin to understand the why behind his compliance. We just talked about Shanda's its intense control, but how did that environment specifically warp Paul? He wasn't just living with her, he was swallowed by her. This is a severe combination of parental alienation and an intense dehumanization that I talked about earlier, which is basically when a person completely loses their individual identity just to survive the toxic system. He became her instrument. Actually, let me stop and think about that for a second, because it's really easy to just look at the court files and see a willing participant. But I need to stop here for a minute. When I look at the childhood records, it makes my stomach churn. You can see the exact moments his personality starts to fade. He wasn't just a quiet kid. He was a muted kid. He was completely cut off from the outside world, isolated from his father, and constantly fed a narrative that the world was hostile. That's where parental alienation starts to twist a child's reality, poisoned his mind against anyone who wasn't her, leaving him with the only source of truth, one source of safety, her. And when you have only one person in your entire universe, dehumanization happens fast. You stop having your own thoughts. You stop saying, I feel this way, and start thinking, what does she want me to feel? Your psychological boundaries are totally destroyed. In clinical terms, we call this boundary dissolution. He couldn't tell where his mother's twisted desires ended and where his own identity began. I know that's a lot to take in. It is incredibly dark here. It's hard to comprehend. But we have to slow it down some if we need to. But we have to look at why this actually matters for you and me. Because this isn't just a horror story from a courtroom. I kind of wish it was fiction. It's not. It's a window into how easily human nature can be bent. If we don't understand how a normal kid gets broken down, we can never hope to spot the early warning signs of extreme control in our own life. So how does a son turn against his own brother? How do you look at someone you grew up with and decide to participate in their suffering? In a highly abusive household, a rigid, toxic hierarchy is formed. It's a survival of the fittest environment, but it's in your home. In that position, you quickly realize you only have two options. You either stand up for the scapegoat and become the next target, or you fall in line. You become the accomplice. And Paul chose survival through compliance. I want to circle back to the concept of traumatic bonding again because it's key here. You may have heard of Stockholm Syndrome. Probably most people have. But within a family, this is even more devastating. Paul didn't just obey Shanda because he was scared of her, though he certainly was. Anybody would. He bonded with her. When a predator controls your food, your sleep, your sanity, your brain does something bizarre to keep you alive. It forces you to align with the predator. You start to seek their approval. You start to see the world through their warped, abusive lens. The physiological imperative then was to bond with the predator to prevent a total mental collapse under absolute control. So when Shanda told Paul that Timothy was a problem, Paul's brain accepted it. It had to. If he didn't believe her, the cognitive dissonance, the mental pain of knowing he was helping torture his brother would have driven him mad. He had to convince himself that Shanda was right. He had to believe that Timothy somehow deserved it. This wasn't just him being a bad person. It was a desperate, unconscious psychological defense mechanism called rationalization to keep his own mind from fracturing. But here's where it gets complicated. Because even though he was a victim of this extreme systemic coercion, he was also an active participant. He had moments where he was alone, moments where he could have made a different choice. And trying to reconcile his status as both a victim and a perpetrator is one of the most difficult clinical puzzles we can try to solve. Just look at the posture here. It's incredibly stiff, almost like he's frozen in place. And his voice? There's almost no pitch variation at all. It's completely flat, monotone. That sound familiar? Honestly, it's like he's reading a grocery list or reciting a weather report just like his mom, instead of describing the horrific torture of his own brother. Now, to most people, to the jury, to anyone watching this online, this looks like pure cold-blooded apathy. It looks like a total lack of remorse. And I get why people see it that way. It's deeply unsettling to watch. Let me rephrase that. It's actually not apathy at all. What we're seeing is a profound, defense-driven form of emotional numbing and dissociation. Let's break down what that actually means, because it's a clinical concept we throw around a lot. When a human being is subjected to and participates in prolonged and extreme trauma, the brain eventually reaches a tipping point. The emotional pain is simply too massive for the conscious mind to process. If Paul allowed himself to actually feel the weight, the sheer horror of what he was doing to Timothy, his psychological core would have completely shattered. He wouldn't have been able to function. So his mind did what minds do when they are trapped in a nightmare. It deployed a defense mechanism. It literally flipped a switch. He had to shut off his empathy entirely to perform those acts under his mother's orders. He had to separate his actions from his feelings. And what's fascinating and tragic is that this exact same defense mechanism is still running right there on the witness stand. He hasn't come back to reality yet. He's still functionally dissociated. It's like he's watching himself from a distance, narrating a story about someone else. Clinically, we call this depersonalization. He's physically present in that courtroom, but emotionally, he is miles away, protected by a thick wall of psychological numbness. It's a heavy concept to wrap your head around, isn't it? This matters to us because it shows how the mind adapts to survive the intolerable. It's not necessarily about evil. It's about a brain completely overwhelmed by trauma and survival. And this brings us to that big reveal that I talked about earlier, the psychological bias that almost everyone missed in this trial. It's something called diffused responsibility, or what clinicians call the agency shift. I mentioned this briefly earlier. When an authority figure, especially an incredibly domineering, terrifying mother like Shanda, takes absolute control of an environment, a strange shift happens in a subordinate's brain. Because his mother ordered every single act, Paul's brain told him, I'm not really the one doing this, she's doing it. I'm just the instrument. He offloaded the moral weight of his actions entirely onto her. And it's a terrifyingly effective way the mind protects itself from the crushing guilt. In his mind, he wasn't the torturer. He was just a follower of the rules. He was just the messenger. And this shows just how devastatingly powerful authority can be over a fragile, enmeshed psyche. But here's where it gets even more complicated. If we look closely at his interrogation, we see something else. We see him trying to justify what had happened. He starts rationalizing. He mentions how Timothy was difficult, or how they were just trying to discipline him. This isn't just lying to the police. This is cognitive dissonance in real time. His brain is desperately trying to bridge the gap between two incompatible thoughts. I'm a good person, and I helped torture my brother. To survive that mental conflict, he has to rewrite the narrative. He has to convince himself that there was a logical, necessary reason for his cruelty. It reveals a deeper, more tragic layer of self-deception that most people completely miss. Next, we need to look at how this fragile defense starts to crack when he is finally removed from Shanda's presence, which reveals something about the human spirit that you probably didn't see coming. For months, his psychological survival relied entirely on a highly structured, deeply toxic ecosystem. Under Shanda's absolute authority, his sense of self had completely dismantled. In clinical terms, we refer to this as coercive control and identity stripping. He wasn't functioning as an independent agent anymore. Instead, he had become an extension of her will, adapting her rationalizations and cruelties to protect himself from becoming the target. To survive this environment, he constructed a rigid, fragile defense mechanism, a combination of severe compartmentalization, emotional numbing, and cognitive distortions. He told himself that what was happening was necessary, normal, and even justified. But this psychological armor is only as strong as the environment that feeds it. The moment he was physically removed from Shanda's immediate presence, the supply chain to his delusion was abruptly cut off. In clinical observations, we often see that when an individual under severe emotional conditioning or a shared delusional behavior is separated from their primary influencer, a phenomenon known as decompression begins. Without Shanda constantly reinforcing the distorted reality, the silent, terrifying space of isolation took over. At first, the defense mechanism tried to hold. He likely clung to the familiar scripts, the rehearsed answers, the cold detachment that had kept him safe for so long. But without her physical proximity, her intense gaze, her constant psychological auditing, the structure began to warp. The human mind can't indefinitely sustain the massive energy required to keep horrific truths locked away once the external pressure is lifted. This is where the cracks began to appear. Underneath the cold, detached exterior, the repressed reality of what had transpired began to leak through. We see this in the sudden shifts in the body language, the faltering voice, and the gradual breakdown of the rigid, rehearsed narratives during the questioning. The cognitive dissonance, the agonizing conflict between his conditioned loyalty to Shanda and the undeniable horror of his actions became too heavy to carry. And this leads us to a profound, almost unexpected revelation about the human spirit. You might expect that someone subjected to such intense, prolonged conditioning would be permanently broken, their moral compass completely and irreversibly shattered. We often assume that once a person crosses a certain line under the influence of a malignant figure, their humanity is entirely gone. But what we witness when his defense finally shatters is something entirely different, and it's fascinating. It reveals that the human conscience is remarkably resilient, even when buried under layers of psychological abuse, manipulation, and systemic brainwashing. The innate human drive toward truth, empathy, and moral reality can't be completely extinguished. Isn't that good news? When he's removed from her presence, the cracking of his facade isn't just a sign of weakness. It's actually his humanity fighting its way back to the surface. The tears, the panic, and the sudden, overwhelming wave of guilt are the agonizing first steps of a conscience waking up from a deep, induced slumber. It's the painful realization of the devastation left in the wake of compliance. It shows us that no matter how tightly the manipulative figure winds or psychological grip, they can never fully own another person's soul. And that's good news. The human spirit, even when given a small breath of clean air, will naturally begin the agonizing process of seeking the truth. As we analyze this from a clinical perspective, it forces us to ask a difficult, highly reflective question. How do we navigate the complex boundary between severe psychological conditioning and personal accountability? When the fog of control finally clears, how does a person begin to rebuild a shattered self from the ruins? Let's take a step back from the raw, incredibly painful details of this courtroom and look at the larger, chilling clinical picture here. The most terrifying lesson from Shanda Vander Ark's case isn't just the sheer level of physical cruelty. It was terrible. But it's how a highly organized, brilliant mind can completely compartmentalize and rewrite reality to justify horrific actions. We often think of severe abusers as chaotic, impulsive, or visibly unstable people. We expect them to look like the monsters we see in movies, disorganized and chaotic and obviously broken. I mean, just look at them. But the clinical truth is far more unsettling. Shanda's mind operated like a high-performance engine that was systematically rerouted to run on poison. She possessed an incredible, almost pathological capacity for mental division. Compartmentalization is a term we use a lot in psychology, but what does that actually look like in practice here? Imagine your mind is a massive concrete building with completely soundproof rooms. In one room, you're a law graduate, a structured professional, an orderly citizen who values rules, intellect, and civic duty. In the room right next door, however, you're orchestrating a living nightmare for your own child. Under normal circumstances, the doors between these rooms would open. You would feel the overwhelming heat of guilt, shame, and massive cognitive dissonance. What have I done? The screams from one room would shatter the peace in the other. But in a mind like Shanda's, those concrete walls are reinforced with steel. She could step from one room to the other, lock the door behind her, and feel absolutely no emotional leakage. She genuinely and deeply believed her own narrative. To her, the strict protocols and legalistic rules that she enforced weren't a form of torture. They were a necessary logical system of family management. Wow. And that's the terrifying power of a highly organized mind. It has the intellectual horsepower to build incredibly sophisticated justification for its worst impulses. It can weaponize structure to make cruelty look like parenting. But the damage of this mental wall doesn't stop with the person who built it. A gravity well of this size inevitably drags vulnerable family members into its toxic orbit. Shanda created a psychological black hole in that home, and the closer you were to it, the harder it was to escape its pull. Her older son, Paul, was caught in the exact event horizon, completely unable to pull himself away. He was conditioned to believe that obedience to her was the only path to safety, transforming him from a protective brother into a tool of her control. When a dominant, highly organized figure decides to rewrite reality, they don't just do it for themselves. They force everyone in their immediate environment to accept that warped reality as the only truth. They systematically dismantle the boundaries of those around them, slowly replacing their natural human empathy with cold, rigid directives. This is the macro lesson that we must take away from this. Pathological control does not look like chaos. It looks like structure, and it looks like rules, and it looks like a highly disciplined parent who simply has high standards or a strict household. If we only look for the chaotic, obvious signs of abuse, we'll completely miss the cold, quiet systems of control operating right in front of us. We have to learn to look past the surface in order to ask ourselves, is this system built on love, growth, and safety? Or is it built on the absolute erasure of human vulnerability? As a licensed professional counselor, I've seen how easy it is for people to build smaller versions of these mental walls in their everyday lives. We all compartmentalize to some degree, and sometimes we have to through the hard days. But when we start using structure to avoid looking at our own toxic behaviors, we take the first step down that very dangerous path. If you want to see how these extreme masks of control play out in other high-profile clinical cases and how to spot them before the systems become too deeply entrenched, you got to take a look at this next analysis. How do we protect the vulnerable when the greatest danger is hidden behind a mask of highly organized, everyday, normal behavior? That's something to think about.